EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Well, a happy Thursday to each and every one of you. Thanks so much for tuning in to EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders, where we ask you to ask us. No, we don't do that. We ask them the question. What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? I'm making this harder than it needs to be. What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? So if you have kind of a sticking point that maybe would keep you from considering the Catholic Church, we want to talk to you about that today. And also, if maybe you're in conversation, if you're a Catholic and you're in conversation with someone who has a particular hang-up about the Catholic Church and one of its teachings, we'd like to talk to you about that here on today's program. If you'd like to be part of the show, the number's 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, that number is 1-205-271-2985. And we'll even put you straight to the front of the line at 1-205-271-2985. You can always send us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. That's ctc@ewtn.com. I'm Jack Williams, sitting in once again for Tom Price. Charles Beery is producing the program. Your call screener is Matt Gubensky, and Jeff Burson handling our social media efforts. So if you are watching us on YouTube or Facebook Live, you can type a question into the chat window, and it may find its way to us by the end of the program. And our host is he is every day, Dr. David Anders. How are you?
Jack, doing great. Thanks. How about you?
Terrific. Thank you very much. I should have written them down. We should tackle the questions that are asked in the open. That thought occurred to me as I was listening to the questions roll by in the open, and I know one of them was, why do I have to earn salvation?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate the question. So, the Catholic faith teaches that we cannot be saved without God's grace, and that God's grace comes to us from God's initiative, and there's nothing we can do to merit that initial gift of grace. So it's His munificence, His benevolence that grants us that grace. However, what is grace for? What does grace accomplish in our life? And Scripture teaches that grace enables us to do what nature alone cannot do, namely love God and love neighbor. And so through the gift of grace, we're enabled to fulfill the righteous requirements of the law, this love of God and neighbor, so that God can say to us in justice and truth, well done, good and faithful servant. You know, I'm a parent, you're a parent. I want to give my child good things. And it would be the joy of my life and my child's life for me to enable him to do well and then reward him for doing well. You know, a friend of mine once used the analogy of doing yard work in the backyard with a toddler. And here, you know, Dad's pushing a wheelbarrow up a hill. He does not need the toddler's help. But the toddler is bound and determined to help Dad, so he comes by and puts his little hand on the back of the wheelbarrow and pushes with all his might. Did I need the toddler's help to get to the top of the hill? No. Could he have done it without me? No. But do I still reward his participation because it's good for him and it's delightful? Yes, I do. And that's sort of how we think about God's involvement in our works of virtue, that God enables us to do this that we couldn't do on our own, and yet our cooperation is not meaningless so that God can genuinely reward us, because that's what a good father would want to do.
Jim is in Chicago, and he wants to know what the church teaches about fascism.
You don't do it.
Church is again it, as we say down here in the South.
So there is very specific teaching about this topic. Number of social encyclicals of the Church that address it. One that comes to mind was one that was written specifically to the German Reich. It's the only encyclical, to the best of my knowledge, written in German. Brennan der Sorge was an encyclical, papal encyclical, addressing the German Reich during the Nazi era and attacking the errors and the evils of Nazism. Now, see, fascism as an economic and social theory about making the state primary and having all the subordinate social realities basically at the service of the state violates fundamental principles of human dignity and the reality that the family is the primary cell of society. It's also fascism also tends to be nationalistic, and while the church is very much in favor of patriotism as a moral virtue, patriotism and nationalism are not the same thing. Nationalism is a kind of bigoted preference for one's own country over against all other social organizations and other nations, and that would really deny the solidarity of the human race. So the church is against fascism.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Kay, watching on YouTube, wants to know why she should choose the Catholic faith over the Orthodox faith.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the Orthodox faith today differentiates itself from the Roman Catholic Church principally in rejecting the doctrine of universal papal jurisdiction. I mean, that's really kind of the line in the sand. The major difference is the doctrine on the Pope, the papacy. And in preference to the papacy, the Orthodox communions typically hold out the ecumenical council and the traditions of the Church and the Fathers as being the rule of faith for the Church. So you know what the true Church is, you know what the true faith is, because this is what the councils have taught, and this is what tradition has conveyed. So as an outsider to Orthodoxy, looking at that, one of the things that's always occurred to me, sort of puzzled me, is, okay, well, which ecumenical councils? Because you get divergent lists depending on which Orthodox communion you're talking to. The Copts have one list, the Byzantines have another, the Assyrians have another, and of course there's no way to really adjudicate that, short of a sort of arbitrary assertion that, well, my list is the right list, unless God has given us some objective authority that can interpret not only sacred scripture but sacred tradition. And so I looked to Jesus Christ and I said, what form of government did Christ institute in the church? Did Christ say, if you have a question about the Christian faith, consult the ecumenical councils that your communion acknowledges? Or did he say, thou art Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church?
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. It's a free phone call anywhere in North America. 833-288-3986. It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's really awe-inspiring to know that Take Two with Jerry and Debbie has the impact that it does. We know from what our listeners share on the air, but also from corresponding with them outside of the show via email and social media. There's no better feeling than knowing you've helped someone, maybe many people at a time, work through various situations and to more clearly see God's purpose and plan for their lives.
Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, tomorrow, noon Eastern, on EWTN Radio.
The church does not exist to condemn people, but to bring about an encounter with the visceral love of God's mercy.
Father Wade Menezes of the Fathers of Mercy can help you respond to God's call with Catholic Essentials, a guide to understanding key church teachings. This book is full of faithful and concise discussions to help you learn about basics of the faith and help you live and defend them in your everyday life. Quickly find answers you need to questions on faith, reason, sacred liturgy, God's mercy, and much more. Father Wade gets to the heart of many church teachings that conflict with today's culture, offering clear answers, explanations, and solutions. Catholic Essentials, a guide to understanding key church teachings by Father Wade Menezes, the latest release from EWTN Publishing, now available at EWTNRC.com or call 1-800-854-6316.
If you're an internet type and you consume maybe some of your news and information from the internet, I've got a great new website for you to check out. It's called Church Pop. It is sort of maybe a more youthful spin on the traditional news site. It has all sorts of stories about the Catholic Church and about other things in culture as they relate to the Catholic Church. And they come at it from a unique perspective, and I would suggest that you check it out. You can find him at churchpop.com, and you can actually have headlines every day from Church Pop sent right to your inbox. Just log on to EWTN.com/subscribe, or click on subscribe, 833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. We've got an email from Francis that came. Actually, Francis was holding on the line yesterday at the end of the program when we weren't able to get to him. Said, "Good afternoon, Dr. Anders. My name is Francis, and I have a Presbyterian friend, and he says that the true church is actually the quote-unquote invisible church. Would you happen to know what he means by this?"
I do know what he means. Yes, thank you so much. So the history of the Protestant doctrine of the invisible church is very interesting to me, and I don't believe that most Protestants actually know their own history here, right? If you were to ask a typical modern denominational Protestant, what do you mean by the invisible church? They would say something like this. Well, I think the invisible church is the collection of all of Christ's faithful throughout the world, those who have made a true commitment to Jesus and he lives in their heart, and it's not coterminous with any particular Protestant or even or Christian denomination, but you find wherever there's genuine faith in Jesus, you have membership in the invisible church, and so you can't really number them, and you certainly can't identify them with any visible organization. They're sort of scattered around the world in the hearts of true believers. Something like that would be the typical Protestant understanding of the invisible church. Now, the interesting thing is that's really not what the original Protestant reformers believed about the nature of the church, even though they're responsible for a doctrine of the church's invisibility. And this is how it went. They had a different interest. Denominationalism wasn't their thing. John Calvin, in particular, he knew he had a problem on his hands when he promulgated the Reformation, because he recognized that he was departing from Catholic history. He recognized that this was a break, this was a discontinuity in the church's history, and he would open himself up to the charge of changing the faith. And so he had to find a way to respond to that charge and make it seem that he wasn't really departing from Christian tradition. He was merely sort of pruning the abuses. That's the way he wanted to be understood. So this is what he said. He said, well, look, the church has always been there for 1,500 years throughout the world, held together by baptism and by the creed. And so there have always been faithful who have held to the creed and held to baptism, and that was sufficient to sort of keep the embers of the faith smoldering and alive. But as he understood it, the rest of the faith kind of got covered over, sort of smothered by the papacy. And he used the image of smoke. He would talk about the papal smoke that came in and sort of obscured everything, so that the church was weak and wounded and just sort of barely clinging to life with faith and baptism. But he didn't want to suggest that the church had been utterly extinguished, because he knew enough to know that would vitiate the promise of our Lord. And so for Calvin, it was invisible in the sense that it was buried under a heap of superstition. And once he, John Calvin, and the other reformers had come by and blown away the smoke, scraped off the accretions, eliminated the superstitions, then those embers could come back to life and burn brightly. But at no point in time did Calvin, or Luther for that matter, or Cranmer, or Zwingli, ever approve the idea of denominations. In their view, once they had scraped away the barnacles, blown away the smoke, there would still be one holy Catholic and apostolic church with a continuous visible history and hierarchy and lines of authority and sacraments that could be seen in the world. And in fact, Calvin, what really prompted his Reformation was a concern for sectarianism within Protestantism as something that would destroy the witness of the Protestant church. And he was all for advocating institutional governmental unity within Protestantism. In fact, Calvin is the first person I know of to use the word denomination, and he used it in an entirely pejorative sense. In the mid-1540s, in a book against astrology, actually, he talked about Christians who worship according to their own design, like coins of so many different denominations, and he thought that was just execrable and terrible. But what happened by the 18th century in Protestantism was the idea that you were going to hold all Protestants together through their adherence to the Bible. It vanished. It went up in smoke, and nobody thought that was realistic. And so they had a new problem, which is that well, the Bible really isn't clear after all, and we really can't all get on the same page. So how do we answer that polemical challenge? And they said, aha, we know. All you have to do is agree on sort of the essential spiritual content of the Bible, and the church is an invisible entity, and these visible distinctions don't make any real difference. So it's not a biblical doctrine at all. It was a modern Protestant invention to counter the problem, the difficulty of what do you do with all this disagreement among Protestants. So that's kind of a brief history on this idea of the invisible church. Now, what does the Catholic Church say about all this? Well, when Jesus founded the church in Matthew 16, Matthew 18, he gave specific instructions on how you could kick people out of it. He says, if you find your brother in sin and he's not repentant, take him to the church. If he doesn't listen to the church, you have to treat him like a tax collector and a sinner and kick him out. It's very hard to kick somebody out of an invisible institution. So one theologian said one time that the Catholic Church is as visible as the Kingdom of France.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. 833-288-3986. Call. Give us a call with your question today for Dr. David Anders. Derek is watching us on YouTube from Uganda today, and he says, my Protestant friend asked me, why did the Pope and Catholic leaders command the killing of the reformers, yet they had or have no powers over taking anyone's life?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question. So it was not the Pope per se, it was rather Catholic monarchs that sought to impose the death penalty on heretics in their own dominions, right? Because in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, heresy was understood to be a civil crime and not only an ecclesiastical crime, in much the same way that today we would regard treason as something that was a capital offense. If you tried to directly undermine, say, the Constitution of the United States through acts of treason, you're undermining the basis of civil life, and therefore you would be subject to severe penalties. I liken it to this. Imagine if, when Eisenhower or Truman was in the White House, if during the Red Scare, if somebody had snuck into the president's bedroom and left a copy of the Communist Manifesto on his bedside table and then snuck out in the middle of the night, the president woke up and saw that, what do you think he would have thought? He'd have been terrified. He'd been scared out of his brains because, the commies had infiltrated the White House and they probably had designs on his life. Well, something very much like that happened in 1535. There was a French theologian, Swiss theologian by the name of Antoine Marcourt, who is probably the author of a polemical tract, a kind of a pamphlet or poster, if you will, attacking the sacrifice of the Mass and the Catholic priesthood and hierarchy. Now, if you are a French king in the 16th century, your conception of your own royal authority is tied directly to the sacraments. The monarchy in early modern and late medieval France was understood to be a sacral institution. So if someone attacks the Mass, that is a hair's breadth away from attacking the person of the king, given their form of constitutional government at the time. Now, François Ier was the king at the time, and he woke up one morning and found a copy of Les Placards, the placards written by Marcourt, posted on the inside of his bedroom door in the castle of Amboise. Now, I think about that in terms of the comparison to the Communist Manifesto on Eisenhower's bedside table. All right, he went bananas, Francis I did, because obviously he thought, okay, there are insurrectionists in my own household. And look, there were plenty of people in, particularly in late 16th century France, that definitely saw an alliance between republicanism and the Protestant Reformation, and eventually it led to the wars of religion and to the Glorious Revolution in England, and of course, eventually in France, to the beheading of a monarch. So he had some reason for his antipathy towards Reformation rhetoric and the threats that this would be to the civil order. So he responded by rounding up a bunch of Protestants and hanging them off the balcony by their necks at Amboise. Now, as soon as I say that, you have to understand, and this is not justifying that behavior, but I just want to put it in context, the Protestant dominions did exactly the same thing and worse by far, right? So in England, once England had left the Catholic faith and gone off on their own, it was a crime to be a Catholic priest, even just to be a priest, was against the law in England. And if you were caught as a Catholic priest in England, not only were you executed, but you were executed with every refinement of torture. And if you've ever heard of St. Edmund Campion, he was an English martyr who'd become a Catholic, went to the continent, was ordained a priest, became a Jesuit, went back to England to celebrate sacraments in secret for the Catholic population. And, he knew it was a death sentence. It was just a matter of time before someone would catch up with him. And, of course, eventually a servant at one of the manors where he was saying Mass did turn him in for the reward, and he was pursued and captured. And he was drawn and quartered, which is a pretty bloodthirsty way of dying. If you ever saw Braveheart with Mel Gibson, his execution at the end, you know what drawing and quartering looks like. It's not a fun way to go. That was what was in store for you if you were a Catholic priest in England. Of course, people other than Catholics and Protestants were executed by both sides. Anabaptists and other forms of radical Christianity also were executed by Protestant Catholics alike. Because again, in the time period, both sides saw religion as not simply a private issue dealing with one's interior life, but a public issue that had profound significance for the body politic.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. Wide open phone lines for you on this Thursday. 833-288-3986. Erin called and she couldn't stay on the line, but she wanted to know, how do I address the complex issue of friends having been scandalized and hurt by priests and the hierarchy without resorting to cliches that are so popular these days, like "don't leave Jesus because of Judas"?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. Well, I would certainly never say that to someone, and I think that's really misstates the nature of the difficulty and the pastoral problem and the pastoral approach. My own experience in the Catholic Church is someone who has seen both, some of the best and maybe not the worst, but some poor examples of pastoral care. So I think I'm sensitive to the complaint. My position has never been that I joined the church because of some cleric. And the church is not reducible to the clerical state, or to the episcopacy, or to the papacy. The church is the people of God, and that includes the hierarchy and the laity, not only living but also dead and throughout history. So my own personal decision to become Catholic at a time of great public scandal, in fact, I might add, was because I wanted to go to Mass with Augustine of Hippo and Francis of Assisi and Catherine of Siena and St. Dominic and all the rest of them. And since I have been Catholic, I have been privileged to know priests and laity of surpassing holiness, and they are very few. They're very few. But how many do you need? In my own life, I have had a few shining exemplars of holiness and sanctity among the clergy and the laity who are sufficient for me to see the faith exemplified in their lives and to encourage me in my life of faith and connect me to Christ. I don't count myself among them, and I'm sure that to someone else I may be a source of scandal and stumbling, and I deeply regret that. I hope that is not the case, at least certainly not very often. But I would say, look to the exemplars, look to the saints in your own life and through history who found this path to holiness in the Catholic Church, in the sacraments, together in the company of the saints. The church is not reducible to the hierarchy or to the clerics.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Renee in Norman, Oklahoma, listening on Oklahoma Catholic Radio, asks, what is the difference between dogma, doctrine, sacrament, and all these other words you Catholics use?
Right. Well, we use a lot of words. I don't know that I can go through all of them, but I can definitely talk about dogma, doctrine, and sacraments. Let's start with sacrament to begin with. The sacraments are the rites, the rituals instituted by Christ, so they're extremely special because Christ gave them to us, whereby God conveys grace to the soul. And they are symbols, but they're not only symbols. They're symbols that actually convey the mysteries that they signify. Now, what are the sacraments? I'm sure you know some of them. The first sacrament, the door into the Christian life, is the sacrament of baptism. Christ said, "Go into all nations, make disciples, teach them everything I've commanded you, and baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." Water baptism. St. Paul tells us that we die with Christ in baptism and are raised again with him to new life, Romans chapter 6. St. Peter says, 1 Peter 3, that baptism now saves you. Jesus said in Mark chapter 16, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. So you can look at baptism and see that it is a symbol. Something's being symbolized, namely death and resurrection with Christ, washing and cleansing and purification. These are the things that are symbolized. We also believe that God conveys the reality of the sign, that he actually does regenerate, wash, cleanse, and renew us through the sacrament of baptism. We've got 6 others, but I just ran out of time.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. A couple of open lines for you at 833-288-3986. It's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Wherever you are in the world, you can access the EWTN Global Catholic Network. It's everywhere. You can get EWTN's great Catholic programming on your car radio, at home on your TV, computer, or smart speaker. With EWTN's app, you can take EWTN everywhere on your phone or mobile device. If you want your news in print, turn to EWTN's paper of record, the National Catholic Register. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders is on YouTube. Search YouTube to find the EWTN YouTube channel so you'll never miss an episode of our show or any of your favorite EWTN radio shows.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
You know, there's all kinds of idolatry. If you love yourself more than your neighbor, it's kind of idolatry. We had a lot of idolatry. All the New Agers say everybody's God. I told you, I thought that picture of Mrs. Buddha. Did you ever see that picture of Mrs. Buddha? She didn't call herself that, but she had rolls and rolls of fat like Buddha does sometimes, and she called herself a goddess. That's idolatry. See? I think there are other kinds of idolatry. For example, if a man works so hard he neglects his family, isn't that a kind of idolatry? You want to get ahead? You're going after a thing. And to the neglect of your family, of your children, your loved ones. That's a kind of idolatry.
For more information on Mother Angelica, visit Religious Catalog at EWTNRC.com.
What would you like to talk about?
It's unscripted. That's what we'll discuss tomorrow on Take 2 with Jerry and Debbie.
On most of these EWTN stations.
Now let's return to Call to Communion.
(833-288-EWTN) is our toll-free number. 833-288-3986. Next up is Terry in Grand Rapids, Michigan, listening on Holy Family Radio. Terry, you're on with Dr. Anders.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. I have a question about the Hebrew or Jewish religion at the time of Christ. Currently, anybody who is outside of the Catholic Church is considered a denomination. At the time of Jesus, there were, Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots and Essenes. Were those denominations? And if not, why not?
Okay, thanks. So it's not a perfect analogy. I appreciate the question, but it's not a perfect analogy, and here's why. Because within Judaism, there is an inescapable ethnic component to Jewish identity. I mean, the story of Abraham is the story of Abraham and his progeny, Abraham's physical offspring. And as St. Paul was fond of pointing out in Galatians, Abraham's progeny, his offspring, lived for 400 years in obedience to the covenant before the law of Moses was ever given. So before you have this sort of large architecture of Jewish belief and practice that would come out of the Torah, you still have a Hebraic identity tied to Abraham and the God of Abraham. And so all of these groups in Judea in the first century would have recognized that they all had something in common as children of Abraham, as Jews, as Aramaic and Hebrew-speaking people who trace their lineage back to Abraham and through the monarchy, they would have understood themselves to kind of share that fundamental religious identity as children of Abraham. Where they differed from one another was what obligations does that impose upon them as Jews? How are they to live the demands of the law in their contemporary context? And to be honest with you, if you look at the law of Moses, it really wasn't written with their social situation in view. I mean, the world of first century Judea was vastly different from, say, the world of the Davidic monarchy. The social situation had changed so profoundly. And the most traumatic thing that they all had to cope with was the fact of the Roman occupation. And because in the mentality at the time, if Rome, if pagan powers were ruling over Judea and the city of Jerusalem and the temple, then they never really fully returned from the exile. The hope after the exile was that they would come back and reestablish the national political integrity of a Jewish state that could fully implement the divine law, and that was not happening. And so that was profoundly existentially disorienting, and people evolved radically different ways of trying to come to terms with that. So the Sadducees, for example, pretty much held to the Torah, the law of Moses, and their principal concern was sacrifice in the temple and to the priestly class, and the Levites. And so that was the way you did it. Now, that was a way of life that they actually found easy to accommodate to Roman occupation and to Hellenistic occupation, and the Sadducees were regarded by their contemporaries as kind of the liberals of the day who assimilated too much to pagan culture. Leave the temple in place, let us do our sacrifices and so on, and we'll get on. The Pharisees, you've heard of them, they had a more populist spirituality that saw the holiness arising not simply from the priestly class, but from all the people of God as they sought to really live the life of ritual purity to the utmost. And then they were thought of as sort of half-hearted, weak-kneed liberals by the Essenes, who said, no, you've got to do this thing twice as hard, and they withdrew into the desert for this sort of very apocalyptic end times vision of a radical commitment to ritual purity. And John Bergsma, in his book, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, has some wonderful descriptions of the kind of debates that Essenes and Pharisees would have. My favorite one is the following. They have this business of clean and unclean vessels. If a vessel becomes unclean, you can't drink out of it or pour out of it. So the debate was this: if you have water in a clean vessel and you pour it into an unclean vessel, does the vessel from which you are pouring become unclean? And the Pharisees said, no, it's just the receptacle that's unclean. And the Essenes said, you liberals, it's the whole thing becomes unclean. These were the kinds of debates they were having. So they were sectarian divisions over what it meant to be a Jew, and not a perfect analogy, I think, to the Christian situation.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. It's a free phone call anywhere in North America. 833-288-3986. We have an anonymous email. It says, how would you respond to someone who suggests that all religions are basically the same because they all have something like the Golden Rule?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So, first of all, it is patently false that all religions are basically the same if you broaden your understanding of what counts historically as religion. So if you were willing to take in, say, the history of tribal religion and then the archaic temple religions of like, say, 2,000 years ago, Egyptian civilization, Aztec civilization, that sort of thing, it should be apparent at a glance that those ancient religions have absolutely nothing to do with the Golden Rule. In fact, Aztec is kind of the most salient example. Their religion was based on human sacrifice and imperial conquest and cannibalism. So, you go out and conquer your neighbors and capture their young people and then carry them back into the city, and you cart them up to the top of the stairs and rip their hearts out and sacrifice them to the gods, and then you feast on their flesh. Right? So this is certainly, and by doing this, it was believed, you keep the sun coming up every day. So the job of the temple priesthood is to make sure the sun comes up, and the way you do that is by the ritual slaughter of slaves that you then cannibalize. Kind of hard to square that one with the Golden Rule, I think. I don't think that really fits into your model. To look at much tribal religion, which is even earlier in human history, again, it's typically modeled after just a whole different way of conceiving of humankind's relationship to the natural world and the invisible world, and had much more to do with bringing the tribe into a kind of cosmic harmony with the forces of nature to enable them to excel at things like hunting and gathering and then crop growing when they became agriculturalists. So again, the note of the Golden Rule is just not what's prominent in that particular religious environment. Now, there are examples of tribal religion that have the Golden Rule, but many that do not. Now, once you get into what historians call the axial age of the great civilizations, the Hebrew, Hellenic civilization, ancient India, and China, then you do, I think, begin to find more commonalities among world religions because things like alphanumeric literacy and different forms of social organization forced the same kinds of questions onto different civilizations. And it became much more important to learn how can we live well together and avoid devastating warfare and find peace when we have these pluralistic communities. And so things like the Golden Rule were more likely to develop in these other religious traditions. And you do typically find in those major civilizations of Israel and Greece and India and China some common ethical discoveries, some common ethical basis. Now, from the Catholic point of view, that's exactly what we would expect to find. Now, why would we expect to find that? Well, because the Catholic position is that humankind is basically one. That God didn't make 5 different human races. He made the human race, that we all share a common nature, made in God's likeness and image, and we're all made for the same purpose, for fellowship with God, which ultimately takes place in the life of charity and the moral life. And so since these truths are somewhat accessible to reason, which again is a natural feature of the human person, subjected to the same kinds of historical forces, we would absolutely expect world civilizations to evolve similar ethics. I mean, if something else happened, the problem for Catholic faith would be if that weren't the case, right? But the fact that they evolve along similar lines really underscores the Catholic doctrine of the unity of the human race. There are differences between these traditions, but the Catholic position has always been to say, let's look for those points of commonality, not as being a threat to Catholic doctrine, but really as exemplifying it.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. Still time for your calls at 833-288-3986. Next up is Jeff in the great state of Nebraska, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Jeff, you're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hi, Doctor. I have a question in regard to the ruling today from the Supreme Court and other rulings that are being handed down, maybe regarding the Second Amendment rights. Does the Bible give us some indication or guidance as to, or the Catholic Church give us some guidance as to the Second Amendment as it pertains to us in the United States?
I appreciate the question. Not in the way that you're asking. There's nothing like anything like that specific. And of course, Catholic moral theology is of an entirely different category from American constitutional law. I mean, they're just apples and oranges. So the kinds of things that Catholic moral theology addresses are things like the dignity of the human person, a legitimate right to self-defense, the primacy of the family, the need for social solidarity with one's community, with one's neighbors, the principle of subsidiarity, that the lower social organizations in society should take precedence over the ones further up the hierarchy, and you should only explode bureaucracies as it becomes absolutely necessary to meet certain social goals and obligations. These are the kind of principles that Catholic moral theology advocates, but the moral theologians stop short of issuing policy pronouncements and saying, well, the way that you have to live out, in policy, say human dignity or subsidiarity or solidarity, has to look like this particular political ideology. We don't go that far. So policymakers have to work out the concrete application of Catholic moral principles. But the Second Amendment debate, of course, is something that pertains specifically to U.S. constitutional law. Really, it's a different category from Catholic moral theology.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number. 833-288-3986. Next up is the great state of Indiana. Kim is a first-time caller in Indiana watching us on YouTube today. Kim, thanks for holding. You're on with Dr. David Anders.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. So my question is, in the book of Enoch, and Enoch was given the book of the Akashic records, the book of life, the book of death. Everything, and even from Adam and Eve, from naming the animals to our fates and everything have been documented in the Akashic records, but yet we're given free will.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So let me say, first of all, off the bat, that the book of Enoch is not canonical scripture in the Catholic Church. And
Exactly. It's not.
So we don't regard that as canonical scripture. Now that being said, I as Catholics, we don't have any problem with the idea of God foreknowing the human free actions from all eternity. In fact, that's precisely the Catholic position, that from eternity past, God knows, and not only does he know, but he in fact superintends free human action. And this is the nature of God's omniscience, that he is so powerful that he can be in control of genuinely free human action. Now, you say, well, how can that possibly be? How can we be free if God's in control? Well, the best I can do is offer you an analogy. A parent who knows his child very well, especially a small child, can tell you reliably how that child will respond under various circumstances. And in fact, the parent may choose to manipulate those circumstances in order to induce the child to make the decision that the parent wants. And yet, it's still the child who's choosing. And if that makes sense to you, you just extrapolate that to the divine providence.
833-288-EWTN is our toll-free number, 833-288-3986. Most of you that are listening, whether you're Catholic or not Catholic, the primary example of the expression of the Catholic faith in the United States is the Roman Rite of Roman Catholicism. But you may or may not be aware that there are other rites under the auspices of the Holy Father that are celebrated throughout the world. The Eastern Catholic churches in full communion with Rome that our late Holy Father, now St. John Paul the Great, used to talk about the church breathing with both lungs, both east and west. We have a great program from a Melkite priest, Byzantine priest, in Chicago, Father Thomas Loya. His program is called Light of the East. You can hear it right here on EWTN Radio on Sunday mornings at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. He discusses how the spiritual masters of the Eastern monastic tradition taught that we must think about our own death a few times each day.
Have you done that yet today, Jack?
I have not done that yet today, David. Have you?
I haven't. All right, memento mori. Let's get on it.
There you go. So it's the Light of the East with Father Thomas Loya, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, Sunday morning, right here on EWTN Radio.
Let's get to Eric's question. In
Okay.
Kansas City.
So go ahead.
All right. Well, Eric in Kansas City,
Why
Missouri,
am I here? Why? No, go ahead.
He says, I'm not Catholic because I don't see how I could have a more intimate relationship with God by joining the church. I'm faithful to the Bethel Church. Okay. That's a great, great question, and I really appreciate it. What would you gain by becoming a Catholic, given that you already have a profound sense of intimacy with God? All right. So, look, I mean absolutely no offense. It is possible to believe oneself to be in intimate union with God and to be deceived. Now, that is true for Catholics as well. That's true for Catholics as well. And many people who think that they pray badly, John of the Cross says, actually pray quite well. And many who think they pray well, in fact, pray quite badly. And the Catholic Church has a developed spiritual tradition of mystical theology, the whole force of which is to help us come to realize all the ways in which we deceive ourselves. And if you've ever read or heard of Teresa of Avila and her magnificent Interior Castle, or her Book of My Life, her autobiography, or The Way of Perfection, some of these kinds of texts that she wrote, I like to summarize the entire corpus of Teresa's writings by saying it's all about all the things that are not God. And you say, well, that's pretty obvious. I know that lots of things are not God. And I'm like, you don't even know all the things that aren't God that you don't know that are not God, right? Meaning, in particular, Teresa put it this way. She said, some people are so foolish and weak in intellect that they think that all that they imagine is real. And there is this sort of penetrating analysis of the fantasies of our own imagination that we often substitute for true spirituality in ways that very subtly and subconsciously build up our own self-aggrandizement and our pride and our various lusts and vanities under the cloak of intimacy with God. And I think that probably the easiest way to see this is there's a particular type of spirituality. And Catholics are prone to this too. It's not only Protestants that would do this, but I do see it a lot in some Protestant circles of imagining, literally sort of forming a picture in one's mind of sweet Jesus, meek and mild, of a kind of romantic, sentimental image of Christ, and then picturing oneself in a kind of intimate dialogue with what is, in essence, a sort of projection of one's imagination, like an imaginary friend, and evoking warm sentiments towards that pious imagining, and then confusing those sentiments and those affections and those warm emotions with intimacy with God, when in fact what one has done is build up intimacy with one's own imagination. And it's possible to do that without ever deeply engaging the need for contrition, repentance, and growth in virtue and holiness. And so the Catholic spiritual tradition is oriented towards helping us realize the depth of our own self-deception, to rid ourselves of even the most subtle attachments, not only of our physical life, but even of our spiritual lives, coming ultimately to a place of darkness where we can proceed sometimes only by faith alone, and I don't mean that in the Lutheran sense, but rather in the Carmelite sense, of sheer dependence on God, so that ultimately we can be conformed to His will. So if that makes sense to you, I would invite you to investigate the spiritual writings of the Catholic Church, particularly Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, John Climacus, to quote one of those Eastern characters again, the Desert Fathers, St. John Cassian, and others like them. And you will maybe begin to get a clue of what it would mean to deeply embrace Catholic spirituality.
Stephen is in the Republic of Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Stephen, you're on with Dr. Anders.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking my call. I love the show. My question, playing off one of the previous callers' question, is where does the Catholic Church stand on self-defense?
Sure. So, on the one hand...
Repeat that question. He faded out.
Okay. What is the position of the Church on self-defense? Okay. On the one hand, Christ says that we should turn the other cheek. If someone strikes one cheek, turn to him the other also. If he forces you to go with one while, go with him too, right? And so there is a kind of note of pacifism and non-resistance and a willingness to suffer evil, for the love of one's neighbor within the Catholic tradition. So the right to self-defense is not, it's not absolute in the sense of being adequate and comprehensive for all situations. And Christ, of course, clearly did not invoke that right. At the same time, the Church also teaches very much that virtue, as well as charity, and that would include the virtue of justice, is a genuine good that we must pursue. And particularly when it comes to exploitation of the weak by the strong, the poor by the rich, these sorts of things, the majority of the minority, that the soul has not only the opportunity, but the moral obligation to stand up and do justice and protect the persecuted person. And that can up to and including the use of arms, even to lethal force. The Church has a rather subtle doctrine of the just war. And the kind of conditions that we would be looking for in a just war would be things like one can go to war legitimately when there is a grave evil to be prevented and there's no other way to stop it. Everything else has failed, and the only way to stop this grave evil is through recourse to arms. And the damage done by the war will be significantly less than the evil that you're trying to prevent. And then, of course, other rules like you can't attack non-combatants, you can't engage in, say, total warfare and try to obliterate a civilization, you can't, do genocide, these kinds of things. And yet war is ultimately an evil that we would prefer to avoid.
Kimber's watching on YouTube, and she'd like to know why Constantine changed the Sabbath.
Constantine did not change the Sabbath. As far as I know, the Sabbath is still on Saturday. And if you're a Jew, you go to synagogue on Saturday. If you're trying to follow the law of Moses and all its fine particulars, you're going to celebrate it the same way, that it's been celebrated within Judaism for many, many centuries. Christians don't celebrate the Jewish Sabbath. We don't, right? Instead, the apostles, the earliest Christians, met on the first day of the week to commemorate the resurrection of the Lord. So Sunday is not for us the Sabbath, kicked one day forward in the calendar. It is a different feast. It is the Lord's day, right? And the earliest Christians did not rest from labor on the Lord's day because they couldn't. They couldn't. Many of them were slaves. They were public people. Roman civilization didn't take a 7-day, a weekend off. You got up on Sunday morning. You met the church at the dawn, celebrated the holy sacrifice of the Mass, received communion, and then off you went to, wash Caesar's, toilets or whatever you did for your job.
Chariot.
Right. And it wasn't until the Christianization of the Roman Empire after Constantine that people said, we could actually give people a day off to do this.
Alex writes in, Dr. Anders, I really struggle with the Catholic teaching on sexuality. For example, two men in a relationship. I accept the Church's teaching on the impermissibility of acts which aren't ordered towards life. Most unfortunate time to get a little tickle in my throat. I understand that such acts fall short of the ideal in God's plan, but I also haven't ever received a satisfactory explanation as to why those acts are so evil as to merit eternal punishment. It seems clear why something like premeditated murder would merit such a thing, but why would these acts, which may not necessarily harm someone physically or psychologically, take exception with that. This also applies to birth control. It may not be ideal, but many things can be not ideal without meriting damnation. What makes these things so grave?
So any sin, any category of sin can be mortal, right? So jealousy can be a mortal sin. Pride can be a mortal sin. Disobedience to one's parents can be a mortal sin. Drunkenness can be a mortal sin. Christ said that looking at a woman with lust for her can be a mortal sin, right? So what makes something to be a mortal sin is that, first of all, that it is itself intrinsically gravely wrong, that you know it to be wrong and you do it with impunity. If those conditions are lacking, then it's not a mortal sin, period. Unless you have those three, it's not a mortal sin. But why would there even be such a category as mortal sin, regardless of the kind of sin that it is? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that the proximate rule of human acts is the reason, right? Desiring the reasonable good of the human person. And it's in our reason that we're made in God's likeness and image. So when I willfully choose the unreasonable good, I am choosing not to be like God and to reject my affinity with God. And ultimately, God will grant me the dignity of my own freedom and say, if you don't want to live with me, you don't have to.
On behalf of our host, Dr. David Anders, our producer, Charles Beery, our phone screener, Mr. Matt Kubensky, and our social media maven, Mr. Jeff Burson, I'm Jack Williams sitting in for Tom Price. Thanks for tuning in to EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. We do it again tomorrow, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. Thanks for tuning in. Back at it tomorrow. Until then, God bless.
Cresta in the Afternoon presents the truth of the Catholic faith. In the light of that faith, we analyze our culture's ideas, trends,